It is with absolute great delight that I introduce this evening's lecturer, Emeritus Professor Heather O'Donoghue. Heather is a Fellow of Linacre College at the University of Oxford. She is an authority on the poetry and prose of medieval Iceland and Norway, with an encyclopedic knowledge of Icelandic sagas. She has explored the influence of Old Norse mythology and the influence it had on later poets like Wordsworth or Coleridge, Walter Scott, William Blake, Auden, and Seamus Heaney, and also authors like Thomas Hardy, Herman Melville, and Robert Louis Stevenson. Another feather in her cap, though, relates to a rather different kind of literature. In addition to publishing and lecturing on contemporary crime fiction, Heather was a judge of the Crime Writers Association Gold Dagger Award, and then the Ian Fleming Steel Dagger Award for Contemporary Thrillers. I think that sounds fantastic. Heather led her first ASA tour around Iceland in 2018, and ASA's director, Kristen Hellstrom, travelled on the program. Now, to paraphrase enormously, Kristen was absolutely captivated by this incredible country and how Heather introduced it through the sagas that are woven into the national identity. Heather's other passions also became evident: bird watching and football or soccer, because I believe the World Cup was on at the time. Last year, I also had the tremendous joy of travelling with Heather, losing myself in the eye-wateringly beautiful scenery while hearing the splendid tales of the Icelandic sagas. Tonight, Heather is taking us all full circle on a journey around Iceland. So over to you, Heather.
Hi, everybody. I'm going to talk to you, as Julia said, about Iceland. And I called this lecture to begin with Iceland Full Circle, because the great thing about this particular tour is that it goes all the way round the island of Iceland. About 12 centuries ago, when Iceland was first settled, there was a man called Grim Goatbeard, great name, and he made an epic and groundbreaking journey all around the island, and he was paid a penny by every new settler to circumnavigate the whole island. Now, we can follow in his footsteps going all the way around the island. And so I'm going to show you, first of all, a map of Iceland, and you can see what a long journey actually going all around the coast is. But you can see perhaps from this map that it's just barely possible to cross Iceland east, west or north, south because of those great glaciers in the centre of the island and the mountainous, barren and really unnavigable regions in the middle. So we're talking about going round the coast. I'll begin with a little bit of history. Iceland was settled by Vikings from Norway and also by Norwegian adventurers who'd settled in Ireland and the Western Isles of Scotland and then moved in a kind of secondary settlement with mostly Celtic families. There was a kind of intermarriage going on, and moved to Iceland. And this was in the last quarter of the 9th century, and Iceland was at that time completely uninhabited, apart from a few Irish monks who had washed up almost literally on the south coast of Iceland, looking for the most remote place they could find to devote their summer, at least, to God. They didn't really devote the winter. They were only staying there over the summer. And when the Norwegians and the mixed Hiberno-Norse people turned up, what the Icelandic historians say is that they left quite smartly. That's the best we can hope for, quite honestly. Nobody knows what happened to them. We hope that they upsticked and left. We shouldn't really call now these new Icelanders, we shouldn't call them Vikings anymore, because we should reserve that term really for piratical raiders. And once the Norwegians and the Hiberno-Norse settled in Iceland, they became Icelanders and settlers. Now, some of them did go on Viking expeditions after that, but we'll stick with calling them Icelanders from now on. And in 60 years, from maybe 870 AD to 930 AD, 60 years, the habitable land in Iceland was all settled. So there was this terrific onrush of people, and a new nation began. I'm going to find myself using 3 adjectives quite a lot. That's special, spectacular, and secret. And I'm also going to talk about sagas. So keep bearing in mind special, spectacular, secret, and sagas. And what's the first thing that's special about Iceland is that it's the only country in Europe which has a definite, specific historical starting point. The nation of Iceland began in that period from 870 to 930. And by 930, the settlers had achieved two utterly remarkable things. First of all, they had set up an almost democratic, women not so much, but the men shared an almost democratic parliamentary and legal system. They had elected judges and juries, they had codified laws, they had an annual parliament. And secondly, when they converted to Christianity in the year 1000, they began to produce literature, great quantities of literature. First of all, Christian literature, saints' lives, homilies, biblical commentaries, that's the sort of stuff that was needed to support Christianity. But more famously, great quantities of mythology and poetry, and most famously, perhaps most celebratedly, the famous Icelandic sagas. And a lot of that literature has survived. And then in 1262, they ceded their independence for complicated reasons to Norway. And then in 1944, another rather special thing happened, which is that they voted for independence from then, as in 1944, Denmark, and 99% of the population voted. And 99% of that 99% voted for independence. So this was another remarkable national moment, if you like. Now, most people who go to Iceland as tourists go to Reykjavik, and Reykjavik is a marvellous place. It's a modern and architecturally avant-garde city. So I'll show you a slide of the new concert hall, which is called Harpa. It's on the quayside looking out over the bay in Reykjavik, and I hope you can see that there's something rather like being inside a glacier, being inside a great ice crystal when you're in Harpa. It's a totally remarkable building, from both the outside and the inside. And the next slide is just to give you some idea of what a kind of modern and lively city Reykjavik is. It's especially lively, of course, in the summertime when there's daylight for almost 24 hours. Still quite a thing to get used to if you first go to Iceland around midsummer in June, as the ASA tour does. And lots of Iceland's celebrated tourist attractions are within a day's trip, within reach of Reykjavik. So I'll just show you a couple of them. This is the Great Geysir. A geysir means in Icelandic the gusher, the thing that gushes upwards. And of course, it gives us the, not very modern, but the English word geyser. And every 15 minutes or so, you can see on the left of the screen there, this 20 or 30 foot whoosh of boiling water arises from, and you can see on the right of the screen, this rather sinister hole of kind of boiling, simmering liquid, and then it suddenly erupts. And then we have this astonishing waterfall, which is called Gullfoss, which means the golden waterfall, presumably something to do with the rainbows that you see above it. And you can see that Gullfoss, you see from my slide, is part of a big and very popular tour called the Golden Circle, and that's a circle around Reykjavik. So we're still thinking about being around Reykjavik. And then the other great place you can go to from Reykjavik is Thingvellir, which means Thing Plains, Parliament Plains. And it's the most incomparably beautiful and serene site of Iceland's ancient outdoor parliament. So that's Thingvellir, this extraordinary site where every year Icelanders from all over the country actually pitched tents and amended the laws and met and socialized and passed laws too. But that's not even a beginning, if you like, because this tour isn't confined to Reykjavik, to the capital. Instead, it begins by heading past Reykjavik north along the very beautiful west coast of Iceland. And the west coast of Iceland was once the home of a notorious saga character called Egill Skalla-Grímsson. And Egill was a 10th century Viking warrior and poet, and he was a hero of one of the very many Icelandic sagas. The poet Ted Hughes described the Icelandic sagas as one of the great glories of world literature. And I'll just tell you, the thing about sagas is that, as you know from the kind of modern sense of the word saga, like the saga of when my television broke down, meaning that it took you a very long time to get it mended or whatever. Sagas are quite long. They're also very involved, and they're a very carefully constructed mass of stories. But I'll just tell you one story, because it's one of my favourites, about Egill Skalla-Grímsson, our great Viking poet. When he was a teenager, his older brother, who was handsome and personable and everything that Egill wasn't, he was difficult and not very good looking. When Egill was a teenager, his lovely brother married a beautiful Norwegian heiress. And the saga tells us that unexpectedly, Egill got sick and couldn't go to the wedding. No explanation about that. When some years later, Thorolfr is killed fighting for King Athelstan in Anglo-Saxon England, Egill steps in and marries his widow, who has a 2-year-old daughter. So you think, why did he feel so ill about the thought of his brother Thorolfr marrying this beautiful Norwegian heiress? So anyway, Egill steps in, marries the widow, and brings up the little girl as his own. And at the very end of the saga, Egill is in his 80s. He's old, he's immobile. He hates the fact that he's not as active as he used to be, but he has one joy in his life. And that joy is talking to what the saga says is his favourite person in the whole world. And that's the stepdaughter, that little girl who was 2 when he married her widowed mother. It's an extraordinary human side to these kind of big, heroic and rather violent figures. Anyway, our journey passes through very many of these saga sites. Some of them are spectacular, so there's my other adjective, but all of them are associated with extraordinary, thrilling and poignant medieval stories. Here is a rather dramatic shot from the peninsula called Snæfellsnes, which was actually the site of Jules Verne's novel Journey to the Centre of the Earth. And you can see this peninsula looking very ghostly and spectral from Reykjavik, if the weather is good. And Snæfellsnes is also the site, the location of another of the great Icelandic sagas, which is Eyrbyggja saga. And I'll try and tell you just one story from Eyrbyggja saga, which is a story about a corpse and a coffin. What happens is that a very strange Hebridean woman, said to be in her 50s, interesting that, a mature woman becoming the centre of this medieval story. She arrives from the Hebrides and goes to work on a farm on this peninsula. And when she feels as if her death is imminent, she tells the farmer that she wants to be buried in a place called Skálholt, which the tour also visits. And Skálholt was the cradle of Christianity in Iceland, and she wants to be buried there. So the farmer and his men, the coffin bearers, make the extraordinary journey across the peninsula down towards Reykjavik to Skálholt to bury her. But it gets dark, and it's, as you can see probably, it's dangerous terrain. And they come to a river which they think won't be safe to cross in the dark. So they go to the nearest farm and they ask for hospitality. Hospitality in Iceland is absolutely de rigueur. Hospitality, you cannot refuse anyone hospitality, and it was the same in the Middle Ages. So the farmer says, yeah, you could sleep on my floor, but I'm afraid I've got no food to give you. And they say, no food. And he says, no, I'm sorry, I just don't have any extra. Sorry, can't do it. So they put the coffin down in an outhouse that was used for storing food, and they try to get to sleep on the floor, and then they hear a noise. And they hear a noise, and they think maybe an animal has broken into the food store. And one of them, rather bravely, goes to the food store, and the corpse of the funny Hebridean woman, completely stark naked because she was only wrapped in a shroud, is busy preparing the food that the farmer said he didn't have. So the travellers say to the farmer, we think it would be best if you told us the truth about the food and fed us, because you're going to have trouble from this ghost forever after. And Icelandic ghosts are always not kind of shades and shadows that disappear through walls. Icelandic ghosts are big, corporeal, threatening, kind of almost like the Walking Dead. And so indeed this Hebridean woman, and this Hebridean woman wrapped herself back into a shroud, climbed back into a coffin, and the next day was carried off to Skálholt. My next slide is again very spectacular. It's the island of Drangey in the north of Iceland. So if we're working our way clockwise around Iceland, we're now in the north of Iceland. And another saga hero, Grettir. Grettir was the longest lasting outlaw in the whole of Icelandic history. And he lasted long because he holed up on top of this cliffs on this island of Drangey, which is utterly remarkable, and you can see it from two peninsulas because it's right in the middle of Skagafjörður, this great fjord. And then finally, this very much more serene view of another northern peninsula, Vatnsnes, which was the home of a great saga poet with an Irish name, Cormac. And he wrote extraordinary love poems to a woman called Steingerður, whose name means circlet of gemstones. But then you never trust a poet. I'm married to one, so I should know. Never trust a poet. When it came about that he could marry her, he sort of didn't. And she was, having been compromised by his love poems, she was married off to a much older man who hadn't heard the story of Cormac's poetry. And then if we keep on going, as it were, clockwise around Iceland, we come to the very remote eastern fjords, and here's a shot of that extraordinary landscape as well. The eastern fjords are the location of one of the most celebrated and one of the shortest, I'm not saying that there's a connection there, one of the shortest Icelandic sagas, the saga of a chieftain called Hrafnkell, who precisely because he's so far from Reykjavik thinks he can do what he likes. And he tells a young shepherd of his that the shepherd can look after the sheep, but he must never ride the great stallion Freyfaxi. Freyfaxi means the one with the mane and who is dedicated to the god Freya, so it's a kind of sacred horse. And the boy does, and Hrafnkell kills him, and he thinks he can do as he likes, but he hasn't counted on the fact that the boy's uncle manages to get help from the annual parliament in his lawsuit from some powerful chieftains from the northwest of Iceland. So you should be beginning to see how the Icelandic sagas are so immensely bound up with the landscape that we see on this tour. So I'm going to look at a little bit more detail at the east of Iceland, because that's the furthest you can get from Reykjavik. Some of these settlements were, until the 20th and the 21st century sometimes, accessible only by sea, and they were often completely cut off by snow. Now Iceland has built these great tunnels so that you access these beautiful villages by road, but they're very picturesque and they're still completely unspoilt. So I'll show you one of my favourites. You can see how the mountains act as that kind of backdrop, but until there was a tunnel through those mountains, also made the village inaccessible. Siglufjörður, I'm going to bring in another of my passions here now, is the setting for the novels of a great Icelandic crime writer called Ragnar Jónasson, and indeed the fact that Siglufjörður was cut off in the winter time. It makes, how crime stories very often have an isolated community. And so the murderer's got to be one of a rather close, a terrifyingly close community. That's how Ragnar uses Siglufjörður. And you can see very, very clearly the mountains and the little village. This is a tiny village with a very long name. The village is called Borgarfjörður Eystri-Bakkagerði. And it's this tiny little village, which has, however, the most marvellous cafe in which there are kind of family trees of everybody who's lived there and old photographs, and you can really feel how the community worked. And finally, of these lovely village, this is Seyðisfjörður, which again was only accessible by sea until they built the tunnel in the 21st century. And you can see on the left-hand slide there that there's a rather dangerous pass, and you can just see Seyðisfjörður down by a little bit of blue fjord there. And I think someone once told me there are 300 significant waterfalls in Iceland. This is another one. This is Goðafoss from the north of Iceland, and it has a great story with it. It's where the elected law speaker at the National Assembly, the National Parliament at Þingvellir came from. And after Iceland had voted, can you believe it, had voted to convert to Christianity, he ditched, so the story goes, his figurines of the pagan gods into this waterfall. So there the pagan gods lie in effigy at the bottom of this waterfall, so they say. Now, obviously, one of the special things about Iceland, as well as one of the spectacular things, is its geology. And Iceland came into existence as a piece of land less than 20 million years ago, when a massive undersea eruption forced molten lava to the surface, and it hardened into what we call land. So Iceland sits aside a deep volcanic fault line, and that fault line bisects the island in a huge curve running roughly north-south. And that bisection is the geological boundary between the North American and the Eurasian tectonic plates. So Iceland is literally astride the dividing line between Europe and America. And of course, Iceland is still geologically extremely active. You'll have seen, I imagine, news footage of the recent eruptions in Grindavik. And the geological landscape of Iceland is eye-opening, both for specialists, people who are interested in geology, and for beginners. So here we've got a slide of me actually standing astride that chasm. So I've got my left foot in America and my right foot in Europe. And you can see there the splitting, that very deep and terrifying chasm in northeast Iceland. Or if you don't fancy standing astride a very deep and terrifying chasm, you can just watch boiling water welling up from underground springs. So here's a geothermal area in a place called Namaskarth, and you can see the boiling modern and boiling springs coming up. Hot springs are everywhere. And of course, the other great geological, if you like, sites in Iceland are the glaciers. And they're unforgettable, that the great glaciers of Iceland are unforgettable. So I'll just show you 2 or 3 slides there. That's the tongue of a glacier. So the glacier is high up on the mountain and it's sliding down into this valley. And you can see you can walk along. This is in the national park in Iceland, in the south of Iceland. And you can walk along to the very edge of the glacier. The thing that surprised me most about being at the very edge of a glacier was not just the immensity of it, but the fact that you can't see the glacier moving, but you can hear it. So you can hear a bit of a creak, a bit of a rattle of a few pebbles falling as it moves unbelievably slowly. And as bits break off the glacier tongue, they start floating in, and this is a great example of it, in glacial lagoons. And this is Jökulsárlón, the great glacial lagoon. And the ASA organises an extraordinary boat trip around this lagoon, where you're passing these kind of tiny but extraordinarily beautiful icebergs that have broken off the glacier. And here we have, again, ice from the glacier, which has washed up on a beach. Notice that the sand is not yellow, the sand is black. That's because it's volcanic sand, it's volcanic dust and pebbles, so it's black sands. But see the beautiful crystal icebergs on this strand. And then finally, a quite unforgettable experience is a trip into the heart of a glacier. So here's me again. That's me on the left, and you can see that you can't see very much. It's a kind of whiteout, absolutely extraordinary. And you see these on the right of this slide, those caterpillar trucks that take us into the kind of heart of the glacier. That's a great highlight of the trip. Another great highlight is a trip around an island called Heimaey. And Heimaey is off the south coast of Iceland, so we've come all the way around the outer circle, if you like. And Heimaey is one of the Westman Islands. And in 1973, an eruption covered half of the island. So this is a picture of Heimaey taken from the ferry You can see a little bit of the ferry in the top left-hand corner there. And Heima means home island. And the Scottish poet Hugh MacDiarmid wrote an extraordinary poem called Happy on Heima, and he wrote it in 1939 when, as he was saying, as far as he was concerned, the world was unspoilt. So it's ominous date to that poem. And in that poem, he celebrates a natural world unconstrained by scientific categorizations. So Heima, as I said, is one of the Westman Islands, the islands of the Irish. And it does indeed look rather like an island off the west coast of Ireland, like the Blaskets or the Aran Islands. But when you get nearer, you can see that the harbour, which is just on the left of the slide there, divides the island, and on one side you have the cliffs with all the seabirds and the green tops, but on the other side you have just lava, because that's where the eruption took place. And it buried houses and necessitated the evacuation of all the island's inhabitants. They were all safe. No one was even hurt in the evacuation. It's very extraordinary. This happened around New Year, and there was bad weather, and the island's fishing fleet, the ships, the fishing boats were all at anchor. So they took on board the whole population of Heima and evacuated them. And children thought that the sparks and the fireballs and so on were New Year fireworks. So there's an utterly remarkable museum called Eldheimer Fireworlds, and it's dramatically centred on one house which was excavated and then translated fragment by fragment into this purpose-built museum. And the very newest of the Vestmann Eyjar, the Westman Islands, appeared in 1963. Again, like Iceland itself, as the result of an undersea eruption, and it was called Surtsey. Now, Surtur was a mythological fire giant, according to Old Norse myth, Old Icelandic myth, a fire giant who in the Old Norse stories does battle with the gods, duels with the god Freyr, and is in charge of the flames which will engulf the worlds of god and men at Ragnarök, the Norse apocalypse, at the end of the whole world. And from Heima, you can see Surtsey, this new island, and it looks like a little tiny pale blue mouse far off on the horizon, as if it's asleep. You can just about see it from the mainland too, and I remember looking at it with binoculars from a viewing point on the roof of the Lava Centre. The Lava Centre is a volcano museum on Iceland's south coast. And it's very interactive, it's very exciting. You can, for instance, stand on a footplate which simulates the different grades of earth tremor, which is extraordinary. But the Lava Centre isn't very far from the famously unpronounceable, and I'm just going to have a go, Eyjafjallajökull, which was the glacier which had a volcanic eruption beneath it in 2010 and sent clouds of steam and volcanic dust and volcanic gases and so on. And that was precisely because, I mean, it was such an extraordinary eruption because it was a volcano erupting through ice. It would be like throwing water on, let's say, a fire in your kitchen. You just get an explosion of steam, and that's what happened. Now, that unpronounceable name, Eyjafjallajökull, it actually means the glacier of the mountains of the islands. And I'd never understood the name of it at all, except, of course, that from Eyjafjallajökull, you can see the Westman Islands. So it's the glacier from the mountains from which you can see the Westman Islands. And just as a last point about Surtsey, the island, the new island of the fire giant, it's been preserved as a sort of natural laboratory for scientists who are mapping and analysing the biocolonization of virgin land. So nobody apart from scientists in hazmat suits can go there. And since it emerged, the very first living creature to be recorded on Surtsey, I mean, apart from mosses and lichens and simple plants, was a seabird which perched very briefly on this volcanic outcrop. And now about a dozen species of seabird do nest on it. And that's entirely fitting because birds are the dominant presence on the Icelandic mainland and on the many other islands. And actually, they outnumber the human inhabitants and sheep by a factor of 20. They even outnumber in the summer the tourists. So the remoter parts of Iceland are rightly famed for their dramatic and unspoiled landscapes, but also for the bird life. And of course, one favourite that everybody likes, puffins. Puffins are marvellous to watch. You could watch them all day. And they make this very strange noise, which sounds like when you pull a cord on your motor lawnmower and it doesn't quite catch. That kind of dying whir is the kind of noise that they make. The most celebrated bird location, actually, of course, is Lake Mývatn. Here we can also see a geological formation called a pseudo-crater. But Mývatn is an ornithologist's paradise. Birdwatching in Iceland is particularly rewarding occupation for amateurs because there aren't not very many species, so there's not so much scope for confusion. So there are no proper deciduous woodlands, for instance, so you don't get woodpeckers or tits or warblers or cuckoos, any of those kind of little birds, but you get very, very exciting versions of or species. Representative species. There are only two falcons, two small birds of prey. One of them is the magnificent gerfalcon, and the other is the tiny merlin. And the only other raptor at all is the white-tailed eagle, which is quite massive and magnificent. And you also get what I always think of as northern exotics. So here's my absolute favourite, which is a red-necked phalarope. What a name. It's a tiny little bird, and it bobs around. And I want you to just look at its red neck, because I'm afraid I'm going to talk about that in a moment. So you get red-necked phalaropes, and you get these extraordinary names, Slavonian grebes, red-throated and great northern divers, huge great skewers, which threateningly scope out creches of eider ducklings, where your eider down comes from, and these vast colonies of Arctic terns. Here's a shot of an Arctic tern. I'm showing you this because Iceland is an extraordinarily prolific breeding location for Arctic terns. Arctic terns breed in Iceland, but when the breeding season is over, they fly on a migration, which is just mind-boggling. They fly back to the Antarctic, from the Arctic to the Antarctic, and then in spring back again to Iceland to breed. And that means that they have more daylight in their lives than any other creature on Earth. Extraordinary. We go on to another S now, which is sagas. My own primary interest in Iceland has always been for the medieval language and literature, and the so-called family sagas especially. Although of course birds and volcanoes are pretty fine too. Family sagas are novelistic, naturalistic stories about the lives of the first settlers in Iceland, about how they established that national parliament in 930 and how they converted to Christianity in the year 1000. The surprising thing about seeing saga sites in Iceland is that in spite of the staggering instability of the topography, that is to say, chasms opening up and lava spreading across places, settlement sites have remained pretty well the same. You get a big new farmstead built where there might once have been a 10th century turf-roofed longhouse, but the site is the same. So you can just make out, here's a reconstruction of a 10th century Viking longhouse. The place is called Eiríksstaðir, which means Ericsteads, and it's the home of the father of Leif the Lucky, Leif Erikson, who was the discoverer, in inverted commas, in scare quotes, of the US. So that's where Eric the Red, the father of Leif Erikson, lived, and that's a reconstruction of the kind of house that he and his family would have lived in, built of turf and with a kind of turf roof. And you can go inside and see how the layout works inside. So the situations and quite often even the names of the settlements have hardly changed at all. So apart from the two cities Reykjavik and Akureyri, the patterns of settlement are recognisable from medieval sagas. So it takes absolutely no stretch of the imagination to picture the events of the sagas taking place in these localities. There are a lot of very dangerous whitewater rivers in Iceland, and they're now, as then in the sagas, called Hvitá, the White River. And here's another waterfalls that are just marvellous. Here's a waterfall, Dettifoss, but you can see, can't you, that that's quite a barrier to moving through the country, and you can see why those coffin bearers in Eyrbyggja saga that I mentioned early on felt that this was not a place to tackle in the dark. Now, you can trace the events of Hrafnkell's saga on a map of the eastern fjords of Iceland, and you can do it physically as well. You can see exactly where Eyvindur pursued his enemy and where he killed him. You can see too. And one of the most spectacular sights is this great long serpentine lake, Laxdale, which was a very strategic location because it was a long, thin lake which you had to cross somehow, and there was one crossing point, and one place where the water was a little bit shallower than normal. And Hrafnkell, the chieftain who murdered the shepherd boy, was exiled by his neighbourhood to beyond Laxdale, but he rather smartly settled just where you could cross Laxdale. And that meant when his enemies arrived by sea from being abroad, they had to pass his house, which was not a great idea to get to the rest of Iceland. So here's Laxdale, now looking extremely peaceful and beautiful, this long and beautiful lake. And of course, going round Iceland like this, you will be following not only in the footsteps of Grim Goatbeard and also of the saga's characters, but also of Victorian literary figures like William Morris or H. Rider Haggard, who wrote King Solomon's Mines, of course, but also a funny pseudo-saga called the Saga of Eric Bright Eyes, and more recent travellers like W.H. Auden, Louis MacNeice, or very recently, Simon Armitage. So I move on to secret language. My friend Fanny, who has always been on the tour with me, an Icelander, used to say that Icelandic was a kind of secret language because so few people spoke it, and it's very difficult to learn, actually. It's extremely difficult to pronounce. Icelandic, for the specialist philologist or anyone who's a history of the language specialist, you can see that it's definitely a member of the same language family as English and German and the mainland Scandinavian languages. But as I say, it's hard to pronounce. And it hasn't changed very much since the medieval period. So all Icelanders today can read the sagas. And indeed, a lot of my students who are scholars of the sagas can read Icelandic newspapers by the same token. And a good way to become at least a little bit familiar with the language is to work with place names. So that, for instance, Reykjavik. Reyk is related to the English word reek, which means in slang to smell terrible, or in Scottish dialect to smoke. And Vik is like wick, W-I-C-K, which means an inlet. So Reykjavik is just steamy inlet. And one of the other things that the Icelanders have preserved since the Middle Ages is a system of patronymics. That is, children take in the place of a surname a patronymic, which is their father's name with either son or daughter after it. And the names, the popular names in Iceland are still the names that were in the sagas, still Sigurður and Gudrun, still Olavur and Thorun. And in downtown Reykjavik and in other towns and small towns and villages, many of the streets are named after sagas, and the names from the sagas are present in lots of other forms. Fishing boats, for instance, are often named after mythological figures. And I want you to recall that sweet little red-necked phalarope. In Icelandic, a red-necked phalarope is called an Óðinsháni, which means a little chicken of Odin. And according to Old Norse mythology, if you were sacrificed to Odin, you were hanged by the neck. So I'm afraid that red-necked phalarope has a connection with Odin that's very evident in its name. And of course, new words for concept which didn't exist in the Middle Ages have been built out of ancient elements. I'll just give you one example. The word for them, computer. A computer in Icelandic is called a tölva. And tölva is a word made out of two other words. The first, the verb to count or to tally up. That's the verb telja, which is like a bank teller, someone who counts the money, right? And that's combined with the word for a prophetess or a sibyl, völva. And in Old Norse mythological poetry, it's the name of the immensely wise and memorious female speaker of the greatest of the mythological poems, Völuspá, which means the prophecy of the seeress. So völva and telja give you tölva, right? Which is a magnificent and almost magical counter-up of things, i.e. a computer. And that takes me to another interesting feature of modern as well as medieval Icelandic life, which is that women figure very largely in saga stories and have maintained a kind of feminist independence, which is still going strong today. I'll tell you 3 stories involving extraordinary women from the sagas. The first is from a saga that's full of good stories called Laxdale saga, which is located in the northwestern area of Iceland. And its heroine is Gudrun. Gudrun, as a teenager, is elegant and precocious and a great match. And she has a dream in which she loses 4 things. And that dream is interpreted as the fact that she will have 4 husbands and will survive all of them. And for instance, the first dream that she has, the first thing that she loses, is that she has a headdress, but she thinks it didn't really suit her. And when she leans over a river, it falls into the river. And that's interpreted as her being married off to a man she didn't really like, and he drowned, and so on. And at the end of the saga, one of her grandchildren asks her, which of the husbands did she love the best? And she says, I was worst to the one that I loved the best, because actually she never married the man she really loved. And when he married somebody else, she just couldn't bear to see him married to somebody else, and she incited her own husband to kill him. So she was worst to the one that she loved the best. Perhaps generally recognised as the greatest of the Icelandic sagas is Njáls saga, which is located in the south of Iceland. And Njáls saga is just, again, full of great stories, but it begins with an absolute cracker. It begins with the most beautiful and marriageable woman in the south of Iceland. And she is married to the handsomest and richest and most glamorous man. And the marriage, and I'm putting this delicately, never quite got off the ground. So she explains to her father why it didn't. And her father is a great lawyer. And her father says that he will try and negotiate a divorce settlement and try to get her dowry back. Meanwhile, the failed husband goes to stay with his brother, who organised the marriage, and that's something you have to remember that's important. His brother organised the match, organised the marriage, and so the failed husband goes to stay with his brother. And they're having a great kind of feast in the brother's hall, and they see 3 little children playing on the floor. So they stop to see what the children are playing, what game they're playing. And it's 2 boys and a girl. And the older of the 2 boys says, let's have a game of make-believe. And he says to the girl, you be the unhappy bride. And he says to the boy, and you be the man who couldn't have sex with his wife. And he says, and I'll be the lawyer, and I'll make a case for a divorce and to get the dowry settlement back. Well, imagine the 2 brothers are absolutely mortified, particularly the one that arranged the marriage. And he goes for a stick to hit the children with, and the failed husband, the other brother, stops him from chastising the children. And he says, he gives the boy a gold ring. And he says, it's not good to make fun of people. But on the other hand, being a lawyer is a great ambition. And thereby he proved what an impressive person he was, in spite of his embarrassingly failed marriage. I'm not going to tell you why the marriage failed. You'll have to read the saga. It's somewhat explicit. And then maybe my favourite woman in all the sagas is the wife of a saga character called Gisli. Gisli is an outlaw. I mentioned Grettir before. Gisli is an outlaw, and Gisli can't bear to be separated from his wife. That's not what you expect from a medieval story, is it? Anyway, he can't bear to be separated from his wife, and so she gets him a hideout in a sort of cellar beneath her farm. So when his enemies turn up, the leader of the gang says to his wife, "It must be horrible for you living here, miles from anywhere. If you tell me where Gisli is hiding, I'll give you a purse full of silver." And she says, "Can I see this purse full of silver?" So he shows her this great bulging leather purse with silver coins in it. And she says, "Can I hold it?" And at that moment, a little girl who is the serving girl dashes off and dashes down into the basement, into the cellar, and says to Gisli, "Gisli, you have to run away because your wife is going to betray you." And Gisli says, "I do not know how my death will come, but I do know it will not come through my wife's treachery." And he stays where he is. Meanwhile, back in the farmhouse, she's holding this great bag of silver, and she says to the leader of Gisli's enemies, "And can I do what I like with this silver?" And he says, "Yes, yes, it's yours. You can do what you like with it." And so she hurls it at his face and breaks his nose, and there's blood all over the place. And he says straight away to his men, "Take her and kill her." And his men stand and say, "Look, you've embarrassed yourself enough. We're not going to kill a woman about this." So Gisli lives to hide out for another day. It's a marvellous moment in the sagas. I want to finish by talking about changes which have come to Iceland. Iceland has suffered a number of land-changing, or at least land-threatening events. The first settlers, allegedly, at least their stories say, that they found an island which was wooded from forest to shore. But a few decades later, they lived through an environmental catastrophe when a combination of clearing, made worse by erosion, left the island almost completely bereft of trees, as it is now. In the 18th century, there was a colossal eruption at a place called Laki, and it covered thousands of square kilometres of Iceland with lava. It dimmed the sun all over Europe. Gilbert White of Selborne, in his Natural History of Selborne, noted that the summer was dark. Iceland was under Danish rule at that time, and the Danish Parliament debated whether Iceland was worth keeping on as a country. They thought they might just ship out all the inhabitants and put them in an empty bit of Denmark. But somehow Icelanders, with their secret language and their long-held traditions, held on. And self-sufficiency in the face of hardship was held as such a virtue that the noble laureate Haldor Laxness actually satirised it in his most famous novel, Independent People. And then you've got the melting of the glaciers, of course. Seamus Heaney, the Irish poet and Nobel laureate, flew over Vatnajökull, the largest of the Icelandic glaciers. Here's a picture of Vatnajökull. It's the biggest glacier in Iceland. It looks pretty extensive. In his poem, Heaney imagines it coming loose and kind of wallowing, as he puts it, down to the sea. But glaciers don't come loose. They shrink steadily and imperceptibly and unstoppably. Like the hands of a clock, you can see that movement has taken place, but however carefully you watch, you can't see it happen. Herring fishing was once Iceland's most lucrative industry, but it's gone. It's over. The herring have gone. And the banking crisis nearly did for the economy in 2008. But Icelanders are alert to economic and environmental harms and how to combat them. So that Iceland is now a centre of scientific expertise in volcanology, seismology and environmental change. And its tight-knit and resilient communities have always lived with volcanoes and earthquakes and glaciers. But they've also lived with the traditions and extraordinary literary heritage of their really unique and special settlement. Iceland is a place of exceptional natural beauty where the modern world and the medieval past coincide. So I end with this slide, which is a picture I took myself. It's a view from one of the hotels that we stay in on the tour, and it was taken at 11 p.m. Thank you very much.
Has anybody got any questions for Heather? If you'd like to unmute yourself and ask a question.
Yes, please. You were saying how difficult the language was, and it certainly sounds it and looks it.
Yes.
I noticed there were umlauts and accents, and then another looked like a cross on top of the letter.
Yeah.
From whence do they come? Well, that's especially the cross. It's new. I've not seen it before.
Yeah, it's a letter called eth, E-T-H, it's called in English. And it's a D with, is that the one you mean, a D with a line
Yeah.
across the, both that and the other strange letter, which is called thorn, which is like a P, but with a longer ascender and a longer descender. Those letters actually came from Anglo-Saxon Old English, because Anglo-Saxon monks helped with the conversion of Iceland, which involved literacy. Until then, nothing was written down in Iceland. So when they started to want to write things down, they borrowed those letters from Anglo-Saxon. So you can see also those letters in Old English, and they're pronounced like TH in English. So thingvellir or Gudrun.
Goodness. Well done, you. To learn it. Thank you.
Have you got a question?
Yes, I just wanted to know if you had seen the stoplights in Reykjavik, which are in the shape of a heart. And apparently they did that after the financial crisis to make things seem better.
Yeah, I haven't seen those lights, but I know that I spoke to Icelanders after the financial crisis, and it was an absolutely extraordinary time. And unusually, I mean, at least it wasn't the case in Britain, the bankers were squarely blamed for the collapse. And there was really quite a time of social tension, as well as the fact that all imported goods cost a tremendous amount. And you can imagine quite a lot is imported in Iceland. But things have got better, and Iceland is now prosperous again. I mean, and it is to do, I think, with social cohesion. Everybody pulled round and worked extra hard and pulled together.
Yes, it was just rather a quaint thing to see. And the other question I've got, have you read the book by Hannah Kent, an Australian woman, called Burial Rites?
Yes. In fact, in one of the tours, a couple of travellers asked if we could go to the location where the heroine is buried, which we did, a lonely little church. And so that can be part of the tour. Very extraordinary. Yeah.
Well, I will take this opportunity then, Heather, to say thank you so much. That was absolutely splendid. And thank you all for joining us.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you.